Welcome to the first webinar in our series on guided reading. I'm Debra Crouch, and I'm really excited that you're joining me to talk about guided reading and think about guided reading across the grades. So as we get started, I'm going to get us, I'll set up here so you can see my screen. And there we go. And if you have not already printed out the reading development chart, now would be a really good time to get that printed out. A link should have come to you today that gave you access to this document. We're going to use this number of times during the session, so it's one of those kind of keeper items once you get it printed off, and then you can use it in your own work. So we'll be thinking a lot about that today. So in our webinar series, we're going to start off with 3 sessions that are K-5. And we'll be talking about across the grades. This first one today is going to look at collaborative meaning making in small group. The next one will focus on learners looking at assessment and forming groups. Then we'll look at text in the 3rd session. And then at that point, we're going to divide into some reading stage / grade specific sessions. We'll have an emergent session, an early session, fluent, and advanced readers. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for some of those or all of those. So as we get going today, the session today is guided reading, collaborative meaning making in small groups. And our agenda for today is going to look at what is guided reading, so coming to a common definition of what guided reading would look and sound like in the classroom. We'll think about best practices that are critical to have a really engaging and effective small group lesson. We'll think about what it means to co-construct meaning and look at the way that talk, purposeful talk, plays a part in small group work and helping us to think and talk well about a text, and some really specific ways that we would be thinking about guided reading. So as we go in and think about a definition, the definition that comes to mind first is this one that comes from reading in junior classes, that tells us that guided reading is students, with the support of the teacher, reading, thinking, and talking their way purposefully through a text. So one of the things, this is a really an early definition of guided reading, and one of the things that I think in some ways has gotten lost is a lot of times it's the teacher doing a lot of work in guided reading. But what we want is for the students to be able to apply the things that we've taught. David Hornsby adds to this definition in his book, A Closer Look at Guided Reading, where he says that guided reading is the teacher helping children to use strategies that they already know to read an unfamiliar text independently with success. So these are a couple of definitions, I think, that really launch us down down the road to thinking about the idea that guided reading is kids applying what they've already been taught or been exposed to in our lessons and our demonstrations, so that they can try that on themselves with a text that they haven't seen before, but being very, very successful as they are reading and thinking and talking their way through that new text. So one of the things to think about are the best practices that are critical for an engaging and effective small group lesson. And often when we hear a question like this, we focus first on what's going to actually happen in the group time. But I'm going to flip this question a little bit and have us think about, what do we want the classroom context for guided reading to be? So I've been playing with some visuals and playing with some ways of looking at that, but thinking first and foremost that when you are creating a space for effective guided reading, we have to come back to the conditions of learning and think about, in order for learning to occur, the conditions of learning have to be present. So when we think about conditions, we think about immersion and demonstration lessons that will occur where we're supporting kids to understand what it feels like to make meaning, understand and demonstrate, or what we will demonstrate for kids on ways to handle text, ways to come into text, ways to make meaning in text. Those immersion and demonstrations will be supported when kids are engaged in text. So one of the conditions that we have to consider is engagement. And engagement has some very specific principles that mean that children are more likely to engage with the demonstrations that we're providing. One is that children see themselves as learners. So children have to see themselves as readers and as writers to engage with our demonstrations. They have to understand how the demonstrations are important to their lives and how the reading work that we do is going to be supporting them as they're reading other texts on their own. They have to be free from harm, that feeling that as they make attempts that they're not going to be harmed in any way emotionally or physically even if they make those attempts. And they have to have a relationship with the teacher. So they have to trust and really want to emulate what the teacher is demonstrating. And engagement's more likely to occur if we have high expectations for our kids, that we recognize that the kids are capable of taking responsibility, that we give them time for practice and employment of what it is that we've taught, and that the kids are free to approximate and get feedback and response from us, the teachers, but also from all the other students that are engaging in the classroom. So the way that we bring those conditions to life, it exhibits in all of the different literacy approaches that we are putting into place and into practice, and the ways that we approach them. So when we're looking at read aloud and shared reading as opportunities for immersing kids in text and demonstrating how print works and how we get to meanings and how we make meanings when we're in text. Guided reading being one of those literacy approaches. And recognizing that in any of those literacy approaches that we have this mix of the teacher, the learner, and the text that's happening within all of those practices. And then also recognizing that the teacher doesn't mean just the adult in the classroom. Peter Johnston always said we can't forget that the adult is not the only teacher in the classroom. And so as we are working with kids, there's going to be a lot of thinking and talking that takes place in all of these different literacy approaches, so that kids are working their way towards meanings and deepening understandings while they're learning in the classroom. So keeping all of those in mind, that's providing that context for guided reading to be a really powerful and effective instructional strategy. One of the things that we also want to keep in mind is that when the kids are reading during the class time, that this is one of the big practices that Richard Allington has identified as a difference between the more and less effective teachers' classrooms. So one of the questions that always comes up as we begin to think about guided reading is, what are all the other kids doing while I meet with a guided reading group? And so one of the things to think about is that when we are working with kids in Read Aloud, we're also looking ahead and thinking about how are we putting those books out and making them available for kids as they go into their self-selected reading from the library. Do we have a basket in our libraries that's books we've read together, so that kids can come back to those books that they've already enjoyed and made meaning on, and deepening their own understanding. And then offering them opportunities to read on topics of interest. So one of the things that kids could be doing while the teacher meets with guided reading could be going into the library and reading self-selected text. You may have children who are coming back to texts that we've used in shared reading. So with our little primary kids, our Ks and 1s, they might be coming back in and rereading the shared reading text that we've already read together. I might have other work that kids in upper grades are going to be working with on, continuing to work on texts that we've read together. They may be listening to books on audio and on their computers, so that they're listening to stories. And they might be doing some writing about reading tasks that give them the opportunity to respond to text in writing. The kids may be doing some types of extended skill work or word work that is taking them into looking at the graphophonic work, like word sorts or alphabet and vocabulary activities. They may also be rereading guided reading books. Our younger kids, one of the most important things that we can do is make sure that we don't take the books back to a book room without giving the kids opportunities to have times to reread and reread those guided reading texts, because it's through the rereading of those texts that the kids really consolidate all those reading behaviors that we are supporting them to learn. Our older kids may be having opportunities to read parts of the text that away from the teacher from guided reading. So, taking a text that we've introduced in guided reading and then using it in a independent reading so that they can do can come back prepared for some ongoing conversation. A couple of other things that we want to think about is making sure that we have some type of a place where kids can respond to text that's not written, an artistic or a makerspace kind of place where kids can go out and transform the ideas and thinking that they have started in guided reading with the text that we're using. And then also offering them opportunities to follow up and do some research, because one of the things about really good guided reading texts is oftentimes kids are left with lots of wonderful questions. And so we want to give them opportunities to go out and research and find some ideas about the questions that they have. So here are all the different kinds of things that kids might be doing while the teacher's meeting with a guided reading group. So one of the things to recognize is that if you're using some type of a management system that supports kids to go out and work in these different places, that guided reading is not one of the groupings on your management board, because if it is, it forces you to continually have that same group in every one of your stations or centers that you work with. So the work that kids would do in these activities that you see in these light blue boxes, those would be heterogeneous mixes of kids. What we're going to do is form a guided reading group by bringing together a homogeneous group. So someone might come out of the library to meet with us. Another group might come out of where they're working and rereading on their guided reading books from last week. Another group might come out of this listening station, and another group might come out of the alphabet area. And that's going to form a homogeneous grouping for guided reading. So the guided reading groups are homogeneous groups of kids, and then the stations or the work that kids are doing are going to be heterogeneous groupings of kids. And all of that provides the context for kids to do really powerful independent work, not busy work that is the kinds of tasks that don't really support kids to really grow into, as Vygotsky said, this intellectual life that surrounds them. We want to have really meaningful work where kids are thinking and talking and doing that work independently as well. So let's think a little bit about what it means to co-construct meaning in these kinds of classrooms. So the first thing that I think is such an important concept is that comprehension isn't something that happens at one point. So it's not the thing we do after we've read the text. It's the process that's happening while we're making meaning of a text. It's also something that takes place over time, because our comprehension and meaning making does not stop when we close the book. It doesn't stop when we even get to the end of the book. We continually are refining and reflecting on the understandings that we have. And so we're going to have lots of different levels of understanding that we're incorporating as we make sense of text. So we're going to have a lot of literal understanding. Fountas and Pinnell refer to this as thinking within the text. So this is the kind of word solving and fluency and monitoring and self-correcting that goes on. Summarizing fits into this literal category. So that kind of figuring out what the text says is this literal understanding. There's also going to be interpretive, and interpretive is what Fountas and Pinnell call thinking beyond the text. That's the kind of thinking where we bring those personal connections in, where we make predictions based on what we understand about how texts work. This is where inferencing comes in. So we're making lots of inferences about characters. We're making inferences about the ideas that we're reading about in our nonfiction text. And then another part of interpretive is synthesizing, where we're taking the information that we're getting and we're putting it together and building our meaning across a text. But also it's that making sure that we're understanding the bigger messages that are there in the that are there as we mix the text with our own thinking. And then analytical critical thinking, what Fountas and Pinnell call thinking about the text. Analytical is where we're going back in and noticing the different writer work that has happened by our author, looking at different ways authors have organized, different ways that they've structured their thinking, different photographs that have been chosen, and just all of that kind of author decision making that goes on, and understanding the intentionality behind that. So all of those author kinds of conversations are the analytical thinking about a text. And then critical thinking is what we're thinking about as we make our own meanings, but we also then begin to incorporate all of the collaboration that goes on, and we begin to think about what we think about something once we've had discussions around it, that kind of critical level of thinking. So what I want to do is show this in action. So I want to introduce you to a group of young ladies, 4 girls here, Crystal, Osiris, Kaylee, and Alanis. And these 4 girls, I had the luxury of working with them at a local San Diego school. And the time I came in to work with them, it was right at the end of their 1st grade year. So it was right at the end of 1st grade. And these little girls are in the early stage of reading. English is their 2nd language, and they are all 4 native Spanish speakers. So some of the things that they do as readers is they are tracking print word by word with their fingers. So you'll see this as you watch the video, that's what these girls do as they begin to process print. They also do a lot of choral reading. This was something that was a practice at their school at that time. And so you're going to see these girls, when they go to read the text, they drop right into choral reading. They use pictures to predict and confirm reading. And they seem to process the illustrations and the words separately. Now, looking at the reading development chart in this early column, some of the things that these readers are going to be learning to do as they're working in text at these levels is to track print with their eyes instead of with their finger. And what that's going to support, if you look halfway up this early column, you see that one of the behaviors is them reading with fluency and phrasing. And so as they're learning to track print with their eyes, they're getting that smoother movement versus the word by word reading that tracking word by word with your finger causes to happen. We're also going to begin reading silently in these stages, because one of the things we know is that kids have stronger comprehension when they read silently, and it gives them the opportunity to work their way towards meaning and not the oral reading that sometimes gets in the way of students, especially students who are who sometimes are reading below grade level. We're going to work on using the text and illustration together, retelling and discussing aspects of story. And we'll be thinking a lot about the characters' actions and feelings. The book that you're going to see the kids reading on the video is a fiction story. So one of the things that we want to notice is how the kids are talking about the characters' actions and feelings. And also, even going up into the transitional stage, how they're discussing relationships between characters in the stories. The book that you'll see them reading is a book called My Tree. The text is level E. And just to give you a little bit of idea about how this work has gone up to the point of the video, the first couple of days I worked with the kids, they were reading the book, The Plum Tree. That's the nonfiction book in this pairing, and it shares these key concepts with this fiction book called My Tree. In both of these books, the students are learning that trees are home to a range of animals, and that these animals depend upon the tree to live and to survive. The kids learn that different animals use different parts of the tree as they're working on the tree, and that whole notion of living together is one of the big concepts that comes through through these books. So what you'll see on the video are the kids as they are reading through these first about 6 pages of the book. So the first page we come to is this book where the ant is telling us that this is his tree and he needs the leaves on the tree to make his nest. Right? The kids also learned that information in the nonfiction book. Then in the nonfiction book as well, we had a huge discussion about sap. And the kids were just fascinated with this idea that sap comes from trees and that the ant eats the sap for his food. And I just put a little arrow here to draw your attention to this hole that's in the leaf and the little shading around the hole, because color plays a really important part in how the kids are processing and the kinds of inferences that they're making in this book. Sometimes people have black and white books in front of kids, and the challenge is that you can't have the richness sometimes unless you've got these beautiful color illustrations going on. So just notice how the kids are talking about this when we get into the video. And then we get to page 6 and a second character comes into the story, and that's the caterpillar. And so now we begin to have this little conflict going on where the caterpillar says, oh, no, 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 these are my leaves. I eat those leaves. And so this sets the kids up to have a conversation about this big dilemma that's now come up into this. So I'll give you a couple moments, and we're just going to enjoy watching these girls in action as they have this conversation around these first few pages of this book.
Let's see what else we found out about this character.
That's a sap. That's sap.
There's sap. Now, we saw a photograph of it in the other book. In this book, they did an illustration of it. They drew the picture.
He ate the leaf.
Look at that. Yeah.
He's eating it. He ate the leaf because there's sap on it.
What makes you think there was sap on it?
Because I see the little orange stuff.
Did you guys listen? Did you notice that? Show them what you were talking about there, Alanis.
They ate the leaf because I see the little orange stuff, and the orange stuff is over here too.
Show them, hold up your book and show them in the picture what you were noticing. Show them around the hole how you noticed some of the same color. Did you guys notice that?
Yes.
Around that leaf? So do you think he ate the leaf on purpose, or did he eat the sap? Oh. So what do you think that this ant, he's one of our characters and he's going to talk to us in here? Mm-hmm. He's going to talk in the story. What do you think he's going to tell?
The tree has sap to say the ant. I eat sap. This is my tree.
Now, before you go on, why does this ant say that this is his tree? He says, this is my tree. Why does he think that?
Oh, because he made his house.
There's his house. He made his nest.
He has his food there.
His food is there. What are you thinking, Crystal?
He has things to make his house.
Hold your thought. Let her finish her thought, and then you come back.
He has his food.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
When this is old, maybe he can do another nest.
Could be. It could be. All right, so the ant thinks it's his tree. So let's see. What else?
Oh, caterpillar.
Oh, here's a caterpillar. So what do you
know?
Oh, have a read and see what the caterpillar has to say.
No, said the caterpillar. I eat the leaves on this tree. This tree is my tree.
Now, here's what I want you to do. Go back and read that with just your eyes, without your voice. Did you need to read out loud?
No.
You can read it with just your eyes, can't you? Well, what did you find out here about our caterpillar? Start us off, Crystal. And then you girls jump in when Crystal's finished.
The ant said this is his home.
Why does he think that it's his home?
But the caterpillar is eating the leaves. Oh, so the caterpillar eats the leaves for his food.
Mm-hmm.
So he mostly eats the ant's nest.
Oh.
So now we want to be his house. I think the ant is gonna find that.
So the ant thinks it's his tree. The caterpillar thinks it's his tree. And I saw Okapi be peeking. Let's see what happens in the nest.
The worm.
So at this point, were you with me? We would stop and have you talk but since you're not, some of the key observations that I make when I watch this is how much the kids are enjoying the story. You know, they're using the illustrations to predict the story, and they're really attending to the details that are there in the illustrations. They use that to explain their thinking, so they really are noticing what's going on in the story, all those details. They're making a lot of inferences about the characters and thinking a lot about their actions and their feelings and why one character, you know, would have a problem with the other character. You know, if the ant eats makes his nest from the leaves, and then the caterpillar eats the leaves, he's eating the ant's nest. And so the kids just are coming up with that, you know, really big concept there about that interaction. You do notice them tracking print with word by word, and also that choral reading. So one of the things that I stepped in to do was then to ask them to try reading silently, and just helping them to realize that they can actually do this, because one of the things that I know is that that's something I want to hold as a goal for them within this reading stage. And then one of my roles is using probing questions to extend the thinking. But what I've got to think about is making sure that I am facilitating the conversation in a way that allows all the students to find their way in, and make sure that my probing questions are based on the things that they're saying. Because that's one of the things I think that's really key, is that the kids, you know, if we're thinking about how we build that engagement and that trust, is the kids have to realize that I am actually attending to what they're saying. It's not me with a bunch of questions that I want to ask just to check in on and see if they're understanding. I want to know what they're thinking. And one of the ways that I try and work in a guided reading group is making sure that I'm using wait time. Now, that is not a new strategy, but one of the things that I have to think about is that I need to support the kids with wait time so that they can make meanings for themselves. If I step in with a question, or I step in and begin to call on kids and ask kids to do different things, that I'm not giving them the time to have their aha moments, which really is the power of that. So I can use wait time within a lesson, but the other thing that I can do is I can also craft a series of lessons that recognizes that comprehension doesn't occur in a moment, but it also doesn't occur necessarily in the first time that kids are reading in a text. And one of the things that I try and do a lot is making sure that I'm putting text, positioning text so that kids can make meaning as they're moving from one text to the other. So I want to show you just a short, very short snippet of a day when we brought the nonfiction book, The Plum Tree, and the fiction book, My Tree, back together, and we put the books together and had the kids think between them. So it's a very short snippet, but notice how the kids are thinking and talking on this particular day.
Let me ask you, do you think that animals can share the tree?
Yes.
What makes you think that? Tell us what you're thinking over there, Alanis.
Well, the ant and
The caterpillar.
the caterpillar can't share because the ant needs the leaves for his nest, and the caterpillar needs the leaves for his food. And if they share and the bird will come, the bird will eat them, so they cannot share. Because if the bird comes to the tree, he will eat the ant and the grub and the caterpillar and the bee and the bee, not the bee flower.
So in this video, the things that I notice a lot is that the kids are really constructing a lot more language overall, even though you only saw 2 students speak in this particular little clip. By this point, they're comfortable with the vocabulary, they're comfortable with the language, they're comfortable with their ideas because they've had time to talk them through. And one thing that also strikes me is how Alanis's vocabulary, her language, is so much more academic. And when we think about the ways that we support language development for kids, sometimes it's giving them the opportunities to have extended conversations around a text or around ideas that cross text. And the thing, again, I'm always really interested in is noticing how the kids are really talking well about the relationships among the characters in the fiction book, but also those same subjects when they're in the nonfiction book. And so again, my work has to be about asking extending questions so that I can support them to think about bigger ideas, and structuring that lesson series so that they have the opportunity to think between two books that they've already seen independently in guided reading, and talk about some of the similar ideas and vocabulary that cross those books, because that's the way I'm going to support the students to construct bigger meanings over time. That if I want kids to have the most powerful thinking when they are working independently by themselves, then I have to make sure that every time they're working with me, that the biggest meanings possible are being made. And just recognizing that I cannot be doing things for a child that they're capable of doing for themselves. Marie Clay here talks about, don't do for the child what they're learning to do for themselves. Piaget says that if you actually step in and do something for a child that they're learning to do for themselves, you actually interfere with learning, which is something that I don't think anyone gets up in the morning and thinks about going to school and interfering with learning. So the more that we think about the ways that we support kids to talk in the groups, the more that we can think about how purposeful talk is something that is the kind of thing we want going on in a collaborative small group that we call guided reading. So I want to show you how this looks with older kids too. So you're going to meet some fifth graders here. They are the advanced fluent readers. So on the reading development chart, they're the kids that are in that final column. So they're reading in a text that is up, I think this is a level T as we get to this. So the week before we videoed with this group of kids, I did some work with them, and one of the things I was doing all the way along was keeping notes and keeping track of a lot of the things that they do together. And so I ended up charting that and using that to support the kids in noticing all the things that they already knew about how to think and talk well about books. So things like that they use the diagrams and the photographs and the other visuals along with the words to help them understand ideas. We talked a lot about ways they were figuring out these really multisyllabic words, not only figuring out how to say them, but also what they meant, figuring out what the ideas were. One of the students was really very supportive in showing us how he would act out with his hands and sometimes even sketching out visuals to help us understand the ideas that he was working to communicate. We noticed a lot about how we were feeling about what we were reading, and realized that was how it helped us realize how interesting we were finding the books. The kids were learning to figure out to use the headings to help them notice some of the bigger ideas and help them to think about when to stop and think, especially when they were in those nonfiction books. And recognizing that it's not just about saying the words on the page, but it's making sure that we understand what they mean. And so we're doing that kind of work in this lesson that you're going to see coming up. The book that the kids were reading in this video that you'll see is, as I said, a level T. It's called Animals in Danger, Orangutans. And it's a nonfiction book that's all about disappearing rainforests and the impact that that's having on the orangutans that live in those rainforests. So on the video, the couple of pages that you'll see us zooming in on is this portion here where we're talking about where the orangutans live in the rainforest, and they live in only these two rainforests where they live in the wild. It talks about what they eat, their nesting, and then this home range section was something that the kids were very, very interested in. One of the things that was starting to become very apparent in the way that they read was that the kids would tend to really focus on particular ideas that they were reading and understanding, but sometimes things were getting past them. Like this idea that orangutans are mainly solitary animals. You're going to hear the kids in their conversation having some ideas that these, when the rainforest disappears, they could just all go together and live somewhere else. So you'll see them having some conversation around that. The other piece you'll see is that they got into thinking about how, if these animals are disappearing, how it was going to be affecting other animals. And so the kids bring this up, and so you'll get to hear some conversation here about seed dispersal as the kids actually figure out what that means. And it's quite fun because you can see it all over some of their faces when they actually understand what that means. So let's take a look at some kids as they are reading Animals in Danger, orangutans.
Remember how when we talked about sketching out a visual?
Yeah.
What would that look like? So is that the whole rainforest, or is that just part of the rainforest?
I think it's part of the rainforest.
Okay, so if this is sort of the whole rainforest, each orangutan has a spot,
Yeah,
right? Has sort of a place in there,
it's a square.
and sometimes they overlap some.
So
Yeah.
like some can like join together in one spot.
So now,
Their houses could be connected, and then
so that's their.
and just in case they could communicate to each other by just looking over.
Miss Debra, did you read this book?
I did. I read it too. So I was just noticing your thinking there with that.
Why? Wait, are we gonna be like learning about why they can't like go somewhere else?
I think we might be learning that. Now, what did you find out in the introduction about what's happening to the rainforest? Because remember how we said we have to put different sections from the book together
I learned
to make it all make sense?
that
What's happening to the rainforest?
it's
Getting destroyed
All right.
by humans to clear out
all the
big areas.
So what happens if all of this part gets cleared out? What
That
happens?
is that this part of the animals are getting cleared out. So
yeah,
if
and
they're-
then they could go find like another section of where they live, and then just I guess they could like get everything that they had and just rebuild it inside of their home, and so it could just look exactly the same how it was.
And so what happens if it keeps doing this?
Then little by little, each
Then
part
they'll-
of the rainforest where the monkeys live, they're gonna have like little species of them.
Maybe there's like bigger parts of the rainforest, like somewhere else that they could go that the humans didn't find. You could go over there.
Oh, interesting.
If the whole rainforest goes down, the orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, the orangutan will have no home, and without the orangutans, nothing would exist. Not even another tree. But
So what did it talk about if what happens if these animals, these orangutans they're endangered already? What happens if they go extinct? What were some of the ideas that you
It
marked?
said that it was somewhere in here, but it said that if they weren't here, that like some of the animals would die because of them, because they're their hope and stuff.
So where are you here?
It
Gardeners
says
of the Forest. Page 12.
Yeah.
So flip over to page 12. What did you highlight there? What did you tab? It's a very important point. On page 12 and 13.
go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go.
Okay, it said that there are only 2 rainforests in the world where orangutans still live in the wild, but on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, that's where only like some of them live in different islands.
Yes, Sumatra, I think is how you said it. Sumatra and Borneo. Yeah. And so we've got these 2 rainforests where these animals live, and you were talking, Rosamund, about how that there are other animals that are dependent on these animals. What did you guys find out about that? What is when it says they're the gardeners of the forest?
I learned I learned that orangutans play an important role in the earth life chain because like once they eat, they can actually like
drop or leave seeds on the ground for them to grow, and that's why they're the gardeners of the forest.
Okay. And then go ahead. You found what you were looking for, Rosemary?
It says right here, due to vital role that orangutans play in maintaining a healthy forest, many other animals would be endangered if orangutans became extinct.
Why would other animals become extinct?
Because it says right here, like,
Maybe because go ahead, Frozen.
okay, it said that they eat the fruits and stuff, so they poop them out,
Yeah.
and then they grow new plants. So probably like the other animals eat the plants that they like made.
Totally makes sense. Sam, what do you
Because
think?
they're dropping the seed from their butt, and then it's probably growing whenever the seed is growing.
Yeah. Well, that's how it happens out in the forest with the animals, isn't it? Yeah.
That's
So they spread the
disgusting.
seeds around.
Wait, are these plants that they're like?
The seeds are the seeds are in there. Yeah. Okay. We'll get past the gross part. Let me take you to this next part.
But it's like what I was trying to ask is like, are we eating those kind of plants?
Well, it still wouldn't be there on the plant. You're okay. You're all right.
So I can never help but chuckle when I get to watch that little bit and get to see us discussing animal poop on camera. But some of the things that I notice as I watch the kids is that they're very used to answering questions that are provided by the teacher. And what makes me think that is when Tyler turns to me and asks me if I've actually read the book. And I think because I wasn't asking lots of questions, he assumed that I hadn't read the text. They also tend to kind of cherry pick some of the different ideas from the text. The ideas that make sense to them, they're holding on to, but the ones that aren't quite making sense, I'm not necessarily thinking that they attend to those and try to work through those meanings. They're thinking on the page, but not necessarily bringing ideas across the book. One of the other things about this group is that you could see several times that they were learning to negotiate their way into conversations. Sometimes kids are very used to protocols that tell them when to talk, and they struggle sometimes with that, getting their voices heard in the conversation coming in. They're working their ways through that. And one of the things I think that's really important in that video for me is how they're using discussion to come to meaning. I think if there hadn't been discussion, I don't know that, for example, Tyler would have ever really necessarily recognized that of what was actually happening when it said that they're dropping the seeds and are the gardeners of the forest. So one of my roles is using open-ended responsive questions based on their thinking, so that I'm responding to what it is that the kids are thinking and talking about, and really encouraging them to use, things like text features to support their meaning making, using what the text offers to help them out, and encouraging them to visualize, what has been described in the text. When there are explanations of different kinds of things, I need the kids to really be able to not just say the words on the page, but to make meaning of what they're hearing and thinking about, and really helping them to integrate different parts of the books. The kind of thinking work that's required of kids in this advanced fluent stage really recognizes the need for them to be able to synthesize and discuss the information across this text. And then what we know is ultimately they have to be able to put meaning together that they're making from different texts if they're going to get to the kind of, become the kind of thinkers that, function in a democracy, which is our big ultimate goal, is that these are those kids that are making all those important decisions when we're all old and they have to care for us. So Richard Ellington, one of the things I really appreciate is an article that he wrote called Every Child Every Day with Rachel Gabriel, is some of the conversation that some of the ideas he shares about the importance of conversation. One is that really when kids are in conversations with their peers, not only their comprehension improves, but also their engagement with the text in a real variety of settings. He's citing the work of Courtney Kasdan there. And it's not about recall or retell. And sometimes we're very happy if kids can retell what's happened or recall information. But it's more about making sure that kids are thinking well about the text, that they're analyzing, they're commenting on, and they're comparing the ideas. He also cites in this article that when kids simply talk with a peer about what they've read, they have stronger outcomes than if they spent the same amount of time in the class highlighting important information after reading. So one of the things that we know is kids spend an awful lot of time one-on-one highlighting information in text. But what we know is that from this research that they have better outcomes just through conversation with peers. So independent reading isn't one kid, one text reading quietly. It's kids interacting with text. And Nystran went on to say that when kids are engaged in literate conversations, even if it's as small as 10 minutes a day, they show improved standardized test scores. And that is not why we do our talk work, but that is one of the measures that we're always looking at and saying, are we actually seeing that improvement? So just know that talk is one of those kinds of things that supports kids to do well regardless of family background or reading level. And then the big question becomes, how do you teach kids to talk well about a text? So I defer to my colleague Maria Nichols. She's written multiple books. These are just two of her books. But she talks about the kinds of abilities and shifts that our students are going to need, because one of the things that they do is they come in able to tell, and a lot of times we get them to communicate. You know, they can share what they've read. But that whole notion of constructing is sometimes one of the biggest challenges in a classroom, regardless of grade level. So Maria, in her book, her latest book is called Building Bigger Ideas. And in this book, she expounds on some of the thinking that she started in Comprehension Through Conversation about the talk behaviors that you see listed here, from the notion of getting all of the voices into conversations and how we make sure that, you know, everyone is sharing and their ideas, and that we have all of the possible ideas that we can use to grow our own thinking. That then we move into growing ideas and thinking about, you know, how we support kids to say something meaningful, how we support listening with intent, which is always one of the biggest challenges sometimes, to support kids to take ideas from other people, and not just kids, that's all of us adults as well, so that we can keep a line of thinking alive. We can explore an idea that as it comes onto the table. And then negotiating our way to meaning. So not necessarily coming to agreement on something, but to make sure that the way that we're thinking is a considered response, that we've considered what we think, but we've also considered what other people are thinking about the same thing. And so one of the things that you're going to want to think about is how to build that into your guided reading lessons as well as other lessons. But I want to show you just the very beginning of a guided reading lesson with a group of third graders. They were at the same school with those fifth graders that you saw. And these third graders were an interesting group. They were brilliant as they come, and their belief was that as they all began to share their thinking, whoever's voice was loudest at the end had won, and then everybody else would fall off and they would then get to share their thinking. So the work I was doing with them was not only helping them academically, but also helping them to learn to collaborate in a group. And so this is a short 2-minute clip, and this is the very beginning of a guided reading lesson when we're thinking about how we're going to work together to support our collaboration.
One of the things I want you to think about today, I was noticing last week, sometimes we both start, different people will start talking at the same time.
Yeah.
And what are some of the things that you can do that are considerate of the group when that happens?
I'll stop and decide which one's gonna go talk first.
How are you going to decide that, do you think? What could you think about?
Maybe let somebody else talk if they want, and once they finish, maybe one of them could talk, and if somebody else talks, you could maybe let them, or they could maybe let you.
Mm-hmm. So that taking turns. What were you going to add, Zayden?
Just wanted to say, I wanted to add, you can stop and decide which one, but you just have to
let one person go at a time, so it doesn't make like so you don't have to like fight over it. You just let them go.
How would you invite the other person to start to speak? Like if both two people are speaking and you're going to wait, how would you invite the other person
You would say,
to take the turn?
would you like to have a turn?
Yeah, so just kind of offer.
You can say he can go first.
Yeah.
There we go. So we'll just practice that today. So as we go along, because my guess is we may have two people talking at the same time sometimes, because that happens in every conversation. And so you guys can just try that out.
It's always gonna happen.
It's just normal.
No matter
isn't it?
what.
Yeah, it's just normal. Yeah. So this is one of those things you can use in other conversations too. Yeah.
So by making time for the kids to talk about how they can come into that group, what we're doing is teaching them ways that they can work together so that that thinking well together occurs. And the more that kids are thinking well together, we know that that's going to lead to thinking well alone. So making the time for opportunities to have conversations about how to collaborate and how to work together in a team is going to be really powerful and supportive. So I'm going to take a couple questions now and just think about some of the kinds of things that some of you've asked. So one of the questions that came up was, how long is a guided reading lesson? Guided reading is going to be, depending on the reading stage, it's going to be, I always say shoot for 20 minutes, but knowing that if I'm with a very emergent group, some of those early emergents, those groups are 10 to 15 minutes because that's the span of time that our kindergartners are going to give us there. But if I'm with like this group of fifth graders, our lessons sometimes went 20 to 25 minutes just because there's a lot of conversation. One of the things that you'll see if you ever watch the rest of these lessons, or if you watch me in demonstration lessons, is that we talk more about less text so that we're talking really well. We don't always finish the books in guided reading, and we don't always feel like we have to finish that book on the day that we started on many of those. Another question was, like, when do you teach strategies in guided reading? So one of the things that I try and think about is that I'm not necessarily teaching new strategies in guided reading, but I am supporting kids to apply strategies that I've already demonstrated in read aloud and shared reading. And during the guided reading lesson, one of the things that I'm going to do is, just like you saw at the beginning of that guided reading clip with the fifth graders, is I'm going to be reminding them and noticing and naming the different strategies that we are using, the different reading behaviors that we're using as we make meaning. Another place would be at the end of a lesson when we can pause and have a moment of reflection on how we work to support ourselves to make meaning in the text. So those are a couple of different times when we'll be talking about that. One of the other things that I'm going to just kind of take you here at the end is just to just come back into the webinar series that we're doing. When we get into those reading stages and grade specific sessions, I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about how we're going to be weaving all of this conversation and discussion in. So just know that we'll be returning to those, to that question when we get into that reading stages, grade specific for webinars. I hope you can join me on our next webinar. It'll be on February 24th. And on that, in that particular one, we're going to be focusing on learners. So we'll be looking at assessments and grouping so that we can think about how to make our groups the best possible groups and the best fit groups for the work that we do with kids. Again, thank you so much for joining me today, and have a great evening.